G'day folks, and welcome to this learning diary of the Battalion Combat Series. This is a relatively new series by Dean Essig. There are currently 3 titles in the series, a 4th title forthcoming in hopefully August, September 2021. We have the last Blitzkrieg, we have Baptism by Fire. I have Brazen Chariots in the post, just waiting for it to arrive, and of course that 4th one being published by MMP hopefully later this year. I'm learning the system, and so this video series is designed to track these developments and introduce the series for you. And I'm doing it via Baptism by Fire, which I think is a great place to start. The last Blitzkrieg is has I guess denser stacking, whereas if you can see the map here, this is the scenario 5.2 of Baptism by Fire. It has low counter density. I think it feels like a good introduction to the system, so this is where I'm starting. If you are not familiar with the Battalion Combat series, it is an evolution of the Operational Combat series, the OCS series, which has seen many outstanding publications over the years, also designed by Dean Essig. It was his attempt, BCS is his attempt to distill that down to battalion level, including, in particular, things like supply and being mindful of those supply routes. So in this series, you still need to be mindful of those supply routes, but it's abstracted via things like combat trains and headquarters and supply routes and rules regarding and revolving around this. So wherever your units are, you are looking to see if they're in command range, and if that headquarters, which we can see down here, has a main supply route to their combat train and then off to a supply path off the edge of the map. So you're mindful of that. The game revolves around formations. So here we have the CCA formation and their headquarters here. And they have a command range of 5, which basically means that any units within 5 hexes are in command. So immediately we can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're in command. But this unit up here and this unit out here are out of command. But there are special rules guiding these 2 units. They don't have to worry about command if they don't move. Special rules for this title and this scenario means that they can stay there in this terrain, effectively hanging out, blocking that, threatening German lines, so threatening this main road down here, without having to worry about supply or supply attrition. So you'll always be looking at this formation and trying to keep these units together. The standard rules at least, use a back and forth activation system. When one player has their turn, they activate an entire formation. All the units in that formation do their thing, and then it switches to the other player. There are options for sort of chip pull mechanisms and variable chip pull mechanisms and variable force size chip pull mechanisms. So some good flexibility if you want to change things up a bit. From the start, I'm going to be learning the rules as originally written with this back and forth activation system. So when you begin an activation, basically you check you prepare the formation. You check to see if they've got a supply route. You then make this ever important SNAFU roll, and it is the abstraction of these sort of supply points in OCS. It is a way to abstractly measure the ability, basically, for this formation to do what they want to do. So you make this die roll, you apply a range of modifiers based on how fresh or fatigued they are, how coherent their formation is, what type of road they're using, if they're using roads or tracks, and a couple of little other things. This dice roll for their SNAFU kind of then determines how effective they are, if they're full, partial, if they fail, how many objectives they get for that activation, and what they can do in that activation. Now, ideally you want a full activation. You want your formations to be able to do as much as possible. Once they've made that die roll, you receive typically 1 or 2 objectives if they get a full activation, and you effectively place those objectives where you want to drive your forces towards. So let's say hypothetically these guys wanted to drive towards Faid. I could place an objective there, and let's say somewhere out here as well. Let's say there's some Germans in this area. I can set these objectives. And these are important placements because they tell your forces where they're driving towards, but also it enables them to launch their attacks in that area. You need these objectives to attack. If you've got objectives here, you cannot then attack somewhere off down here where the Germans are. You can't sort of change your plans. This is a formation activation. All the battalions in this formation have activated. They've been set their objectives by headquarters. That's what they're going to do for this activation. The next question then is, how do they get this job done? And this is where the Battalion Combat Series takes quite a break from, every other sort of war game. There's no sort of odds ratios or sort of combat factor differentials that you're working out. There's no complex CRT with odds and die rolls and all that. Instead, you have a range of, in effect, activities available to your forces, depending on what they are. And you've got quite a diverse range of forces. You've got your basic infantry here, and they have the nice, simple assault arrow. What this basically means is that they are good at making ground attacks to seize control of an area. You then have your armor value units. They have a number here, and they typically won't have an assault value. They are used basically to engage other armored forces. They are used for what are called engagements, to sort of clear roads and force the enemy to disengage from their support, clearing roads and things like that, and maybe inflicting hits on the enemy. Sometimes you'll have dual forces with both an arrow and a number, such as this unit down here, a reconnaissance unit with assault capability and an AV value. Depending on what a unit is and really what they're trying to do, they get things done in different ways. So this sheet here summarizes the different sort of activities. An engagement is used by an armor value unit to target a stack containing an armor value unit. It doesn't require an objective marker. So this is typically an engagement that you're participating in on the road to somewhere or in preparation for an attack. You'll notice here, if support drop results, you're trying to remove the ability of your opponent to draw on their support from their formations. So engagement is a way to drop that support, potentially clear the road off, and prepare for these other attacks. If these AV units encounter an infantry unit, so a stack not containing an AV unit, they can participate in what's called an attack by fire. This is effectively where they're barraging the hex. Again, this requires an objective marker, and again, it's just a die roll on this nice little barrage table. You see attack by fire. What type of unit is it? Well, it's none of the above. You'll hit on a 4 to 6. Simple as that. You'll score some hits, depending on sort of what you're doing. You also have attacks, and these are your typical infantry attacks. It's units with an assault arrow, including dual units. You can draw on artillery points. It requires an objective marker, and it's your attempt to bring the infantry in to seize control of an important hex. TAC MA units, these are basically tracked units, your tanks and so forth, your armoured formations. They can engage in a shock attack against infantry. The stack must not contain an AV unit. It requires an objective marker. It's really, if you really want to bring the tanks in, you can do something like that. You have sort of reconnaissance. So this is a reconnaissance unit here. They can do various things. In particular, they place additional objective markers to sort of change things up midway through your turn. So they're quite a versatile unit. They're also quite good at screening, I believe. So you can use these to, in a sort of defensive posture, to slow down the attackers as they come in. So they're the main actions available. There are a few others. You have, so your headquarters has this little number in red. That is their artillery availability. They have one artillery point. Some of the other headquarters will have more, perhaps. And you can use these to, well, in various ways, to support an attack, to suppress defensive forces, to add a die roll modifier on the combat table. So you can see here, if you draw on artillery in a suppression mission, a regular attack will give a +2 modifier, which is quite significant. Alternatively, they can be used in a destructive barrage, where they're basically throwing fire into the hex to try and eliminate defenders. And if that's the case, you roll on the barrage table. And there are various variable number of artillery points you can bring into attack depending on what you're doing. You basically activate one force at a time, one sort of battalion at a time, and they do their movement and they do their fire events. They can have up to 2 fire events each. Basically, again, these types of activities, so they're going to do 2 engagements, or an engagement and an attack by fire, or things like this. And then that unit is done. There are various things that will stop a unit, various terrain stops a unit. And once they've completed their 2 fire events, they are then finished. Units can stop, so I could move a unit up and then stop them without finishing them. I can then start moving another unit, and they can participate in combat, and they can draw on the support or the assistance of that unit that was stopped but not yet finished. So this is all quite a break from the standard I go, you go system, or even standard chit draw mechanism, because the situation, when you activate a formation, the situation they're confronted with can evolve as you have reconnaissance. You set your objectives, you're driving there, but then you can bring along, you can try and do some things, the situation may change, you can bring along a reconnaissance unit who can set a new objective, can change the situation, you can bring a unit along, they'll be attacking midway through. So let's say they've got some German units roadblocked here, you might set an objective here and the objective of Faid. This is not going to happen in this scenario, but hypothetically, German units on this road. You can bring your tanks along. They might attack and clear the Germans out from that objective. Right, the situation has changed. Now I'll bring this reconnaissance unit up to set this new objective out here, and I'll suddenly shift my forces out depending on what happens. And there's no sort of movement phase and then combat phase. It's all happening within the activation of this formation as the units sort of proceed. And so even within a formation activation, the situation can evolve. A lot of people have likened this to sort of a puzzle that you're solving. And I love this about these types of games, where you're confronted with a defensive situation and you've got sort of these fire event options. And this is really just a summary of some of the main ones. And you need to think about how to combine these together with your available resources, your support, your artillery, your various types of units, your armor value units, your infantry or assault value units, your reconnaissance units, to get the job done. So in this scenario, the Germans will be arriving from here and they need to capture 3 victory locations plus a 4th location from up in the north. So how do they get this job done? Well, they could clear this road, threaten the CCA supply route through here. This is where their combat train is. They could drive to the south here. Various ways to, I guess, achieve their objective. And they'll need to think about clearing out these armor value defenders. So you need to think about stacks. Whatever they do will be a stack containing an AV unit, such as an engagement, or they can bring in their infantry for a regular attack. So you think about how to combine these things together. So at the end of your formation's activation, you basically remove their objectives. Those objective markers only last for that activation. So you clean that up, and any other markers often place, such as traffic and temporarily drop support markers. You apply fatigue. You make a fatigue roll to see if these actions exhausted these units. Then you'll apply isolation losses, and this is where this command range is important. If units have sort of driven beyond this the command range, they suffer basically isolation attrition depending on their supply and command circumstances. They then get an opportunity to make a second activation. They make an activation roll, and if successful, they can activate all over again. If that happens, they repeat that process, place objectives, SNAFU and so forth, work through the activations, then end, and then it passes to their opponent who takes their activation in the same way. So bringing all of this together, it's... As a new player, I would describe this as a sort of moderate, heavy complexity game, but once you kind of get going, there's a lot to kind of work through these different concepts. What makes this difficult is the fact that these concepts are new. It is rare to see a game that works in this way. It is rare to see this sort of evolving activation sequence where you have to set objectives and you have to drive towards these objectives, and there's various types of these what are called fire events or combat activities that you engage in. You need to appreciate when to use certain things. If your opponent has an AV support attached to all the units of their formation, you need to recognize that AV support is going to stop your attack by fire and stop your shock attack. So you may need to then think about an engagement first. And it's wrapping your head around the implications of all these things. And once you then appreciate that, I mean, the point I'm at now is thinking about, well, what is a strong unit and what is a weak unit? What do all these numbers actually mean? And when are they used? And how effective will my engagements be? How effective will my regular attacks be? And that really only comes, I think, from practice. I can take a quick glance here and see this is a one-step unit. They are going to be pretty decent in engagement. Basically, in engagement, you add their AV value with you combine their AV value with their action rating for an effective defense of 5. So they're going to be decent. What does that mean? How does that compare to the German units that I'll be bringing on? The Germans, I will point out right now, are much stronger and should steamroll this one-step unit. The infantry, however, let's take this unit down here. They have 6 steps, so kind of tougher to push around, but more resilient, I guess. But of course, they're a long way from their headquarters. They're a bit isolated. And as soon as they start moving out here, they'll start suffering that isolation attrition and will wear down quite quickly. Okay, so what do all the numbers mean on these units? Let me take this unit for an example. Number in the bottom right is always their movement value. So you can always look at the bottom right and see 2 things: how far they can move and how they're moving. Red refers to tactical movement allowance, typically tracked units, but of course this includes armoured cars. A white allowance is a leg movement allowance, they're moving on foot, whereas a black movement allowance is a trucked unit. They're using trucks to get around. The yellow number at the top there indicates the number of steps available. This is a one-step unit, very, very vulnerable. One hit and they're gone. The infantry will typically have sort of 4, 6 steps, variable number, but typically greater than that. The number in the bottom left is important. The fact that there is a number here indicates that it has an armor value. It is, in effect, an armored unit. And this is used for various purposes, often in combination with the action rating of that unit. That little number in the yellow circle just above there. If there is, most of these units don't have a range, but if there is a number below that sort of 3 there, subscript next to the 2, it is the range that this unit can see and fire. And just looking around, I can't see any in this scenario that have that yet. Anyway, of course, the symbol here indicates what type of unit it is. So we can see this is an armored unit. The fact that it's yellow means that it is a hard target. And of course, on the infantry, there's no armor value. They're not armored. The arrow means it is assault capable. It is called the assault arrow. It basically means that they can participate in regular attacks. These are used to basically attack and seize control of hexes. I can't recall where these guys were. I'll fix them up in a moment. What else might you see? Okay, so the combat trains just look like that. They sort of indicate your supply route towards your headquarters, who look like that. They have a command range up in the top left. So you can see this has a command range of 5. They have their activation roll. This is what they're rolling to get a second activation. The typical movement allowance, I mentioned the artillery points. This has 1 artillery point. And when they're done, you basically flip them upside down to show that they're done. What else might we see on these units? Okay, so different types of support. So you notice these armor values. This one's red, this one is clear. And this means different things. The red AV is kind of your aggressive tanks. You have a limited AV, which is sort of more your defensive. You'll have a light AV, which is mainly sort of your light reconnaissance vehicles, and you'll have a black AV, black armor value, which is what's called standoff AV. That's for your longer range. They will often have range values used for sort of longer range. There are various other symbols that you might see. For example, some of the German units about to come up, I believe, have what's called a breakthrough armor value. There are static units, none, I don't think, in this particular scenario. Various types of unit symbols for infantry, motorized infantry, and the like. So look, that covers really the very basics at a superficial level. I've kind of skimmed over some of the main concepts here in Baptism of Fire. There's a lot of detail behind sort of what I've discussed. So I've mentioned engagements, but how does that work? Well, there are engagement zones around units. You enter those, you kind of may need to engage. If it's a red AV, for example, there's all these things I haven't talked about, but I'll talk more about those in my live playthroughs, where I'll sort of extend this learning diary and demonstrate how these various elements work in practice by playing through this scenario 5.2. So check those out in the live feed. This is the setup for the scenario. The Germans will be coming on here and they'll be trying to drive this CCA off this main road towards Sveitler and capture those VP locations in the process. So thanks everyone for watching. Stay tuned, and we'll be expanding on this battalion combat series soon.